So I'm going to take you through a report we did on the challenges facing the school system in Wales, and our suggestions for how things could be improved. So I'll start with about a 20-minute presentation, and then I'll open the floor up to questions and comments. And I should say at the beginning that the suggestions for reform are just that, suggestions, and I'm very keen to get your thoughts on how things could be improved. So as I said, I'm going to start with highlighting the extent of the problem in Wales, which is largely a question of relatively low and declining overall outcomes, particularly in reading and in maths. Sorry, you've got my Skype suddenly disappearing. And don't. Oh, sorry. That's better. Sorry. Some declining overall outcomes in reading and maths, but also relatively and concerningly high levels of inequality in educational outcomes. And then at the second half of the presentation, I'll talk about potential policy reforms that could help correct some of these problems. And that's in the area of the curriculum, assessments and exams, school accountability, and also in use of data by schools in particular. So to start with setting out the state of the problem, so the most kind of high profile and most familiar state of the problem comes from the OECD's 3-yearly cycle of PISA results, which compares countries' outcomes for 15-year-olds in reading, maths, and in science. And these three graphs show the average scores in Wales and the other nations of the UK, as well as the OECD average between 2006 and 2022. And Wales's score in reading has been relatively low as compared with the rest of the UK and the OECD average, and got worse again in 2022. In maths, we saw declining outcomes in up to 2012 as compared with the rest of the UK and other nations, but a little bit of an increase up to 2018, followed by quite a big decline in 2022. And in science, we also see relatively low scores as compared with other countries and a big decline in 2022. Now, the decline in 2022 is partly reflecting of the effects of the pandemic, which can be seen in other countries as well. But the declines in Wales were larger than in other countries and larger than in the rest of the UK, and comes on the back of relatively low scores for more than a decade now, so puts Wales in a even more concerning picture. And there are lots and lots of critiques of these PISA scores, and that they don't measure everything, and they don't. And there are very statistical biases, particularly some that affect Wales in particular because of the way that the assessments are done in the Welsh language. But those have been in part of the system for quite a long time. And the big picture, as I've been keen to emphasise, is one of low and probably declining scores in Wales for quite a long time. It can also be seen at different parts of the income distribution. So these bars show for England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales the average scores for the least disadvantaged pupils. That's the top of each bar, and the average score, that's the line in the middle of each bar, and the position for the most disadvantaged pupils, that's the bottom of each bar. And so in each nation, there are big gaps between those who are the most disadvantaged and the least disadvantaged. And that's a feature of education systems across the world. What we see is that Wales's lower scores can be seen right across the income distribution. So, and it's been a familiar pattern for a long time that the least disadvantaged group in Wales performs a lot worse than similar pupils in the rest of the UK. But we also now see in these scores that the most disadvantaged pupils also perform worse than the rest of the UK, and that the difference is so large now that we see that the most disadvantaged pupils in England, as well as in Scotland, mainly in England, perform about the same level as the average score in Wales, which just highlights just how big the gap is between Wales and the rest of the UK. And it can also be seen in in GCSE results as well as in PISA scores. So for England, we see what we've done is created a measure of the disadvantage gap. So this is the gap in GCSE outcomes between those who are eligible for free school meals and those who are not eligible for free school meals. And then we convert that into a months of educational progress measure in a similar way for both England and in Wales. And in England, the position is frankly quite concerning already. We see a gap of 18 months in GCSE results, which has come down slightly over the last 10 years, but not that much. In Wales, we see an altogether bigger gap between those from disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged backgrounds of around 23 to 24 months, around 2 years of educational progress, a gap which hasn't really changed that much over time. And whilst not shown here, we've kind of looked at so many different measures of GCSE results, and it's almost exactly the same in whatever measure we look at, and whichever way we cut the data. The other aspect of this is that the kind of gap between Wales and England hasn't changed that much over the last 10 years either. So whatever was driving the high disadvantage gap in Wales in 2019 also seemed to be driving it in 2011. It's a fairly persistent feature of the education system. It's not a feature of big differences in policy that have happened over the last 10, 15 years. It probably reflects much longer trends. Another way of looking at it is to look at levels of educational mobility, the chances for those from disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged backgrounds to either be in the top or the bottom group of achievers at GCSE. And we see, unsurprisingly, that those from persistently disadvantaged backgrounds, those who are eligible for free school meals year on year on year on year, much more likely to be in the bottom group of GCSE achievers, those in the bottom 20%. In Wales, around 50% of those in persistent disadvantaged backgrounds end up in the bottom 20%, which is slightly higher than in England. Those is concerning in both nations. But the chances of reaching the top quintile are extremely low across both nations, with a slightly higher chance in England than in Wales. So if we look at those from persistently disadvantaged backgrounds, around 6% of those end up in the top quintile of GCSE results in England, as compared with about 3% in Wales. So we observe huge inequalities across both nations, but slightly higher in Wales than in England. Also revealing, and perhaps even more revealing of the driving forces but underlying this, is when we look at the local area differences. So this map here on the left, or your right, depending on which orientation you're looking at it from, shows the disadvantage gap across local authorities in Wales and in England mapped together. And those local authorities with the darkest colours are those with the biggest disadvantage gap relative to the national average. So all the variation across in each nation is driven by the performance of disadvantaged pupils. And we see that the performance of disadvantaged pupils is almost all, the worst performers are almost all in Wales, as compared to looking at Wales and England together. So there are 6 or 7 local authorities with gaps of more than 24 months, primarily Wrexham, Pembrokeshire, and many local authorities in the valleys. That only applies to one local authority in England, which is Blackpool. We see that that most of the areas with the low disadvantage gaps in England are mostly in London, which reflects some of the high performance in London over the last 10, 20 years, particularly for disadvantaged pupils. Sorry, my Skype seems to be really keen for me to be logging into it. So we know that London is very different, both in its socio-demographics and its history over the last 10, 15 years. But we also know there are lots of areas of England where there are similar socio-demographics to some of the more deprived parts of Wales, presumably including the northeast, the northwest, and many parts of West and South Yorkshire that have much lower disadvantage gaps. If we look at within Wales on the right hand side, we can look at how the disadvantage gap varies across different local authorities in Wales, and we see the gap is largest in, as I said, Wrexham, many parts of the valleys, and in Pembrokeshire as well, and it's lowest in more rural local authorities, principally Gwynedd, Powys and Ceredigion. There has been some change over time, and some local authorities have seen quite favourable changes over time as compared with 2011. So the gap has come down in places like Merthyr Tydfil, Blaenau Gwent, and in Cardiff, but it has gone up in other local authorities as well, and principally in Pembrokeshire and Neath Talbot, where the gap seems to be increasing over time. This is one of my favourite graphs from our report, but is quite complicated to explain. So I'll do my best, because it reveals quite important things about what might be driving differences in Wales. So each dot here is a local authority. The pink dots are in England. The green dots are in Wales. And on the y-axis, you see the disadvantage gap in that local authority. And on the x-axis, along the horizontal axis, you see the share of pupils who are persistently disadvantaged. And so what is not surprising is that local authorities with more pupils who are persistently disadvantaged tend to have high disadvantage gaps, reflecting the effects of persistent disadvantage and high poverty on educational outcomes. But what's interesting is that for a given level of persistent disadvantage, the gap in educational outcomes tends to be larger in Wales than it is in England. So if you look at places like Merthyr Tydfil and Blaenau Gwent, they tend to have very high disadvantage gaps, part of which reflects the high levels of poverty. But there are lots of areas of England with very similar demographics that have much lower disadvantage gaps, that include places like Blackpool, Salford, Gateshead, and Portsmouth, who seem to have managed to reduce the disadvantage gap over time. There are also many areas of England with even higher levels of persistent disadvantage who have lower disadvantage gaps, particularly Liverpool and Newcastle. So to summarise in kind of the perhaps more depressing state of the problem, we see a picture of relatively low and declining skill levels in young people in Wales across lots of outcomes and lots of measures. We also see relatively high and unchanging levels of inequality. We also see that the disadvantage gap is higher than in similar areas of England. And it's worth stating that the levels of inequality in England are not particularly good. They're pretty bad. So it's kind of even worse than that. And it appears to be a relatively persistent gap, stretching back at least a decade or even longer. So whatever driving the higher level of inequality in Wales reflects quite a long-standing factors.